joined in. My name is Shrijit, and I am going to be the moderator for today. I am a Senior Innovation Manager at IDH. Like you would have guessed, today the entire day is about data sharing and actually evaluating how data sharing can be a key lever for system change in agriculture and food systems. While we have different definitions of data sharing going around, but to get everyone on the same page, including the attendees, I would like to redefine what we mean by data sharing. It's basically the way we are defining it is a scenario where two or more value chain actors, which could include smallholder farmers, share data amongst themselves under a set of binding principles and agreements. The intention through this is that it reduces the amount of data that is to be collected and hence the data collection costs. And it also facilitates reuse and recycling of already existing agricultural data. What we believe is that by reducing the costs related to data, there are benefits that can be transferred to smallholder farmers. You can start providing, you can reduce the cost of servicing smallholder farmers. Secondly, it also fuels innovation like we have seen in other sectors such as financial services. And there's also potential to reduce the cost of monitoring and learning, which allows us to make more effective programs in agriculture. So today, in this entire day of the event, we'll talk about different elements related to data sharing. On this panel today, we have members of the Digital Ecosystems Coalition for Empowering Smallholder Farmers. And today, we'll try to understand why such diverse organizations with very different mandates have come together on the context of data sharing and to support data sharing while keeping smallholder farmers at the center of it. It's also important to mention that the support is extended to also having this event. This event is being made possible because of the common interest of all the members on this coalition that are here. Alphabetically, I would like to introduce some of the members of the panels, actually all the members of the panels. And firstly, I would start with Albert. He is the head of smallholder solutions at Rabo Partnerships, and he is also going to represent Rabo Foundation today in this conversation. We have Brenda here, who is a global senior technical specialist in ICT for development with IFAD. We have Iris, who is the global director for innovation and insights at IDH. We then have Sheila, who is a senior manager innovations with ICEEL. And finally, we have Simon, who is the executive director at Syngenta Foundation for Sustainable Agriculture. Today, we'll try to now move deeper into the topic of why this coalition came together, what data means for them, and specifically what data sharing means for them, and also move into some of the key concrete recommendations that the panel might have on promoting data sharing. Thank you once again, all of you, for joining in. And we'll start this conversation with a question to Simon, because Syngenta Foundation was one of the founding members of this coalition. So Simon, can you tell us a little bit more about the Digital Ecosystems Coalition for Empowering Smallholder Farmers, a little bit about the history and its key objectives, especially in the context of data sharing?
Thanks, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody joining today. This is an important topic for us at Syngenta Foundation for Sustainable Agriculture because we're very focused on helping improve productivity, incomes, livelihoods, and resilience for what we call pre-commercial smallholders. So these are the smallholders who are not regularly engaged in market systems, and we're very focused on trying to identify those innovations and test and prove those innovations that can help those smallholders transform the way that they do their farming, the way that they engage with markets, and so on. And then we do spend a lot of time working on the delivery of those innovations through first mile and last mile networks. And so digital tools have the potential to be significant enablers for transformation and progress for these low-income and vulnerable smallholders. So this topic has been something we've been focused on for a long time. In the run-up to the UN Food Systems Summit, we started to recognize with others on this call that this was an important topic to see if we could get some commitments around through the UN Food Systems Summit process. And so we started to formulate this idea that rather than just us individually continuing to do our own programs and promoting our own innovations and solutions, that maybe if we came together in a coalition, we could change the way that data and digital services are offered to and engaged by smallholders, because really there's only one ecosystem for these digital solutions and the flows of data. And we really need to recognize and embrace that rather than just continue to do our own isolated thing. So we started to say, well, how can we enable digitalization to be transformative at scale and in an ecosystem way to the benefit of farmers? This resonated amongst all of us. And we started to recognize that we needed, as you said, Sridhar, in your introduction, that we needed systemic solutions, not just individual point-based solutions. And that we need to look at this ecosystem, both from the public sector as well as a private sector perspective, and start to understand what might be the types of services and the types of data flows that really need a public and a policy framework around them, and maybe a public repository, versus those which are value adding and in the competitive domain of the private sector. We recognized there was a lot going on in the ag tech startup world, but that often these solutions were more about ag tech startups gathering large numbers of farmers on their platform and using that as a basis for capital raising, rather than offering farmer-centric solutions or enabling data to flow across those service providers who could really bring the transformative benefits to the farmers. So we launched, and over the last year, we did a lot of research, particularly focused on deep dives into Kenya and into Zambia. And we found indeed there was a lot of duplication of efforts, that farmers were being asked to enroll in many platforms. Often those platforms then weren't providing value-adding services to the farmers. And often those farmers who were easy to reach were the ones who were being enrolled, and you were getting these large numbers of farmers onto platforms, but not necessarily farmers really benefiting. And so we started to say, well, how can we make sure that there's really open, transparent ways for understanding, especially from the farmer perspective, what's happening in this ecosystem, what data is going to be beneficial to who within that ecosystem, and in particular, how can we transfer benefits as a result of that data sharing to the farmers? So the coalition now is studying live case studies of data sharing to better understand which are best practices. We're working on a white paper to disseminate this. We welcome, obviously, a lot of participation in this effort, back to the point that there's only one ecosystem and we all need to embrace this. We're just taking the lead, but this is not a closed shop. This is an open platform. And we're not, at any particular progress point so far. We're really still at the really starting out in shaping what may be a transformative pathway to data sharing across the ecosystem. So we look forward to working with all of you who want to join and engage in this process, and certainly looking forward to a rich day of discussions today about various themes within this the coalition is trying to address. Thanks, Sridhar.
Thanks, Simon. And I think that's a great context for everyone to have. And few things I picked up is moving away from silos to an ecosystem perspective. You also mentioned the public-private partnership part, so that explains why there are such diverse organizations in this coalition. One thing that was very strong in your comment was on having farmer-centric solutions that actually benefit farmers. So it's not only about doing data sharing from a very voluntary or philanthropic case, but it's actually about thinking about a use case and looking at how this use case can benefit different stakeholders. So thank you for that context. And now to dive a little deeper into the context of data sharing, I want to have a question for Iris. Iris is the Global Director at IDH for Innovation and Insights. And what I understand is IDH is working with different partners, helping them develop data-driven strategies for agriculture while impacting smallholder farmers. So Iris, can you tell me a little bit more about this work, and also a little bit about how you think data sharing can help agriculture become more data-driven in emerging economies?
Yes, thanks, Srijit, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I would like to share two things. So I think we are using data to identify patterns, to understand what works and what's not working. And we also use data to see how to improve service supply to smallholder farmers. So let me first zoom in on the first one. So we started 7 years ago because we believed that we are underutilizing data in our sector. And whenever we are using data, those are islands of data. And there is not a lot of comparability and standardization. Well, in other sectors, there is lots of standardization and comparability. So how come that in agriculture, we are a little behind? So 7 years ago, we developed a methodology to be able to analyze different types of business models, companies that are working with smallholder farmers. And by developing a standard methodology, we now analyzed more than 100 business models in 20 plus countries in 20 plus value chains, both in cash crops as well as in food crops. But this allows us to create insights on what's working for those companies that work with smallholder farmers in terms of what are their costs to serve smallholder farmers. Do they have a commercially viable business model, or are they dependent on subsidies? And if so, what's their path towards becoming independent of subsidies? And what is the impact that they have at farmer level? So we will launch a playbook in September with some of our key insights from having access and having worked with all those different business models. We hope that we can crowd in more organizations that would like to use the same methodology, because we really believe that we need to stop functioning on those islands. Simon referred to isolation. I think if we want to create change in the ecosystem, this is what we need. Srijit, if it's okay, I'd like to also share 2 examples of where we have used data sharing to improve services. So we did a launchpad together with Barry Callebaut and Advance in Côte d'Ivoire to see how data sharing between Barry Callebaut as a trader and processor of cocoa would help improve service supply, financial service supply to farmer cooperatives and smallholder farmers for their cocoa farms. And I think this launchpad helped us to really get into the how-tos, because yes, there was a willingness to share, but there were a lot of practicalities that both organizations bumped into that didn't make it so easy to share data. And the other example which I would like to highlight, which I think is a strong example of collaboration with Rabobank, MasterCard, Cooperative Bank of Kenya, and ETG and Ecom with AgriExchange, is where there is a coalition of different organizations. So a financial service provider, traders and processors, input providers, all those organizations have some data on smallholder farmers. So they have each part of the puzzle. And by using the MasterCard Farmer Network, we will be able to pull together that data, which will, as you indicate, could drive down costs of data collection, but also would improve the suitability of the services that will be provided to smallholder farmers. Why do we find this interesting? Because this type of setup has the potential to reach scale, because those different partners are not focusing on one single crop. So they have the potential to work with farmers and serve their whole farming system.
Thanks, Idison, for that. And it's really good to hear that you started with the point on standardization, and all of this is also driven by a business case and also an impact case. The other thing which was really interesting is that this is nothing, like, it is new, it has challenges, but data sharing is happening on the ground, and there is a possibility that data sharing can reduce the cost of services, as seen from probably the agricultural exchange example, and also improve the customization of services for smallholder farmers. So that's a value proposition that's already emerging. I'll use this private sector example where we're talking about private sector players to move to a more national example and speak about agricultural data. And for this, fortunately, we have Brenda on the panel, who has been working with several governments and also with the private sector. So Brenda, when we talk about agricultural data, from a policy perspective for agriculture and rural development, why is it important? And for you, I wanted to ask, do you see challenges in the way currently agricultural data is handled, challenges and inefficiencies.
Yeah, thanks, Srijit, and good day to everyone participating on this call. Indeed, there are challenges. I think that's where we're coming from as a coalition to come together and say, what can we do to address these challenges? First, I think Simon mentioned about duplication. There is a lot of fragmentation and duplication of data. When you look at the agriculture data, even across government agencies, including private sector development agencies, this fragmentation where everybody collects their own data, understands data their own way, makes it difficult to access that data and even integrate. So the issues that Iris was talking about, ensuring that we have standardization, we have interoperability, fragmentation is actually a barrier to us getting there, limiting how we use data and even how we can collaborate. The other aspect is exactly the topic of today, limited data sharing. If you look at some of the work that we do is often restricted by sometimes, regulatory issues, privacy concerns, proprietary interests. I developed this system, therefore I cannot be able to share the data, or even barriers at national level. So this limitation alone is actually limiting how can data flow from one entity to another, enabling us to build services that are actually leveraging on already existing data. At policy level, the parts of ownership whereby looking at who is owning the data and who is actually controlling data. This usually is actually a thin line, and there's a barrier to understanding and lack of clarity in terms of the variation of who is leading that, who is owning this data, and therefore who has the right to say I can share or we can have an open data sharing. We also need to look at essence of data privacy, which is good to look at it, but also in terms of looking at the positive ways of how we can enable. So that is actually sometimes acts as a barrier, and addressing these issues is crucial for us to ensure that we have transparent way of managing data practically that enables us to share data. The one last aspect that I want to talk about is interoperability. We're looking from the system side, agriculture systems often lack that type of interoperability, which makes it difficult to share data across different systems and across different platforms. One of the elements that we were talking about as a coalition was that we need to look at issues of interoperability. We are different agencies working with different systems, but how do we address the challenges of interoperability and ensuring that there's a way that we can support integration and comprehensive information systems at country level across our different projects to enable data sharing. Last but not least is the issues of access and connectivity. If you look at most of our countries, they actually have challenges in terms of access to connectivity, especially when you go down at smallholder farmer level. In many regions, especially in rural areas, agricultural stakeholders, even private sector, they face the challenge of collecting data because of connectivity and even literacy. So limited access to digital platforms and tools, they're restricting the data collection, therefore having a ripple effect on data sharing. So if we have challenges to collect the data, therefore there will be no data for us to share. So those are some of the challenges that as a coalition, we're coming together and say, how best can we be able to address these challenges to ensure that we create an ecosystem that enables data to thrive at policy level, even the greater issues, and even practically across systems. Over to you, Srijit.
Thank you, Brinda. And I really appreciate how you started with the same point on fragmented data pools. And then when we think about collating it or getting it together in the form of data sharing, we need to care about ownership, we need to think about privacy, we need to talk about interoperability, and we also need to know about connectivity and rural infrastructure so that digital solutions can be integrated and that will lead to data sharing. So otherwise, without infrastructure, it's very difficult to do that. And just as a point on cross promotion for the audience, Brenda is moderating a session on open data in the evening today. And that's going to be one great session to actually learn about how public and private sector can collaborate on this. When we talk about interoperability, one of the key things that comes to my mind is standards. And we also have Sheila, who represents ICIL on the panel. Now moving away from the point of business case to the role of data sharing in driving impact and sustainability. Sheila, what do you think data sharing can help in terms of driving sustainability or impact in terms of, let's say, living income, because ICL is working a lot in these spaces?
Thanks, Srijit. So for those who are not familiar with ICL, we're a organization that supports sustainability systems and their partners to address global sustainability challenges like deforestation, climate, poverty, human rights, and so forth. And both sustainability systems or standards and their certified entities stand to benefit from data sharing. So you asked the question, how can it help to enable better sustainability? We live in a global digital ecosystem. I think all the panelists have already talked about how important data is to improving. So right now we're in a point where no matter how big or how large the size of your organization or what sector you're in, data sharing is become absolutely essential to inform decisions and to help deliver better services and products to stakeholders. One of the top reasons for sharing data in the world of sustainability, essentially it comes down to better decisions. There's been so much tried and tested in this space in the world of development that it's time for us to become more intentional, more concrete with what we want to do and how. We can't keep just driving programs on the ground without being more intentional about what works, what doesn't, under what conditions, and using data to leverage that. So I provide some examples on how sustainability systems are doing this with their partners. One, to drive action. So the data that's collected and managed by sustainability systems through audits, through and so forth, through the improvement programs, it's useful in a variety of analytics that can inform decisions for internal and external stakeholders, actors, if it's shared in an ecosystem. So if we don't learn to share that data better, we can't help the different stakeholders within that ecosystem actually make changes happen. So really driving action. Two is mitigating business risks. So again, data pooling, cross-sector working, leveraging third-party data sets can help drive innovation and mitigate or even avoid business risk. So we work a lot with private sector, and we talked about just now private and public sector partnerships. Really, we want to avoid that kind of business risk. And then three, and I find this really important, is creating insights. So data sharing and collaboration on related teams. So if you're trying to address climate issue, or you're trying to address human rights issue, what's underlying is we want to improve those sort of systems ultimately underlying it. And it really comes down to, having the right sets of data can sort of speak to different sustainability challenges that we want to have and provide insights on where we need to have multi-sector solutions. So this can really accelerate progress towards sustainability goals. And then Srijit, you mentioned specifically the work that we do on improving farmer incomes and living incomes. So a lot of our work is really aimed at driving or supporting and accelerating alignment in action. And we want to have, more people sort of work on this, but so many people are doing work in their respective programs, and we want to try and pull that together. So we work together with our partners to say, what are standardized methodology, work around alignment in methods. And we feel like this helps with sector-wide learning and progress. But we feel like, a lot more focus on getting better at data sharing can help reduce the redundancies. We heard that quite a bit, and able to leverage on each other's work. So Iris gave a really good example of the work that IDH are doing with Barry Callebaut in the cocoa sector with Advance. It's really just how can we leverage the data to provide better services. These are examples that we're also looking out for in how we drive that. And I think that, that just is a lot of what we're doing in that space.
Thank you, Sheila, for highlighting these points. And very important to note that you went beyond the business case to also talk about insights. So it's not about data sharing only between the private sector stakeholders, but let's say we are today collectively working for climate action. We have a lot of pressure to work on climate action, and that's pressure from nature and not from anyone else. But that also requires data sharing. It's not only about servicing smallholder farmers, it's about making better decisions with better insights, and data sharing can enable that. So thank you for highlighting this element as well. Albert, I have kept you waiting, but you come from the financial services side, and the financial services sector is one of the pioneering sectors when it comes to innovations in terms of credit scoring, in terms of serving farmers, and even generally, let's say, sector level innovation. So from your perspective, what do you think the data sharing can enable for organizations that are working with smallholder farmers, and also from a financial services for smallholder farmers perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Srijit, and good morning, good day, everyone. We see data in general as an enabler for product bundling, and that basically has two advantages. It allows the reuse of expensive last mile contacts, smallholder farmers far away, poor road conditions, etc. So also for financial institutions, it's expensive to visit farmers. But it has another advantage. If you bundle services, you can meet the multiple needs of farmers, because smallholder farmers often need more solutions for multiple problems. So reuse of last mile contact from the perspective of a service provider makes services cheaper or relatively cheaper, and bundling of services from the farmer perspective basically helps them to improve productivity and income in a better way. For the financial sector, we see finance as a catalyst in that game. That product bundling cannot happen without financial services. You need finance for input, for working capital, etc. So for us, data profiles and alternative data basically enable higher quality data to be included in the credit processes, and not just higher quality, but also higher frequency very often, compared to annual or semi-annual visits. Also more objective data if it's from remote sensing sources, for instance. And yeah, very simply said, it results in lower risk and lower operational cost for banks, or at the same risk or operational cost, but then you can find new farmers. You can improve your outreach because of that, against the same cost structure. So that's basically more clients, lower costs. That's the ultimate use case for financial institutions. We know how large the finance gap is, so there is something to improve here, and we believe data can definitely help. Also being cautious that data is not the solution for everything everywhere, but let's say the next 10-15% of unlocking that finance gap is definitely possible with data. There are some other use cases. I think a very unexplored use case for data and data sharing, also for the financial sector, is impact measurement. Because transactional operational data gives a lot more insights than traditional impact tools can capture. Also for the financial sector important because of the blended finance instruments and all the other donor involvement that rightly need reporting on whatever happens. There's of course on the ESG side a lot of use cases, deforestation, more in terms of preconditions. We do add products ourselves through our Acorn carbon sequestration initiative. They're basically based on polygon data of farmers that are shared with our sequestration platform. We enable farmers to sell their sequestered carbon in the carbon market. Also beyond smallholder farmers, we do a lot of things with land valuation, and there's always data sharing involved on multiple ways. So yeah, a lot of use cases for the financial sector, with financial sector being very important as a catalyst.
Thank you, Albert, for highlighting that. And the point on bundling probably also aligns to what Iris was mentioning about Barry Callebaut and Advance, because there was some research by the Gates Foundation which said that a farmer requires bundle services and not one specific service. And then if you have to provide 5 to 7 services to farmers, it doesn't make sense for each organization to collect the data from farmers individually. It's all about, like, if you can share it, maybe you can optimize the delivery of bundle services. So that's a great point that you made. Also on the financing gap, you mentioned that finance is a catalyst, and it's close to, I think, $170 billion, the annual financing gap for smallholder farmers. So that's a big market. So there's definitely a business case around data sharing, and thank you for highlighting that. You also highlighted Acorn as an example where farmers are actually directly benefiting from data sharing. So that's like a real life case study of how data sharing can benefit farmers. And it's like with the right governance structure, where probably Acorn is committing to giving a majority of the sales from carbon credit back to farmers. Farmers can be also benefited. So thank you for sharing that. Just a follow-up question for you, Albert, on this is, besides Acorn, have you seen any live innovations that are around data sharing from your work? Anything else that you would want to mention in terms of enterprises or startups that have experimented with data sharing?
Yeah, sure. And I had the privilege to work with 45 FinTech startups in my previous job in Rabo Foundation until recently. And also, we have our own initiatives, let's say beyond Rabo Foundation now in Rabobank. To divide them, I do see three categories. The first category where data sharing is taking place since 5-6 years are the FinTech platforms. And Simon already mentioned a couple of potential, let's say, challenges there. They do share data, they bundle products, they bundle services, they standardize everything, and it works quite well. They often work with unorganized farmers, they aggregate and organize them themselves. But the drawback is that it comes at quite high costs. And those costs have to be, let's say, taken by someone, and that's often by the farmer. Also, there are some questions on farmer independency, because vertical integrations are never the best example for keeping farmers independent, but many of them have achieved great results in terms of income and productivity of farmers. And I think just different situations need different solutions. So that's one extreme where data sharing is already taking place as we speak. On the other extreme, we have seen farmer cooperatives that have done everything by themselves. They combine inputs with output, with finance, with working capital. They all integrate it, and all the benefits go to the farmers through their farmer organization. We have examples like Aldea Global in Nicaragua, a joint partner of IDH and Rabo Foundation. Great example where this is possible. It's highly inspiring, but it's also extremely difficult to replicate. Because of the quality of management that is needed to build all your own software solutions and set the standards, etc. They can do it, but not many can. And that's why there's a category in between where we are very enthusiastic about, and that's what you could call the enablers. And it's a bit of a combination of a business model for tech partners, keeping the farmers and their organizations independent within their domain of influence. A very recent example that we invested in as Rabobank is Avanti, and they will be speaking later today. That's an investment where also IDH has joined this round. That is basically enabling data sharing by bringing a banking app to the farmer organizations who then collect data in a standardized way. And Avanti has all the balance sheet and all the regulations in place to make this work. So it's already going 3 steps further than data sharing. It's also enabling the tools. There are others that even combine the management of farmer producer organizations with tools and with putting skin in the game. So that's one example that we're very enthusiastic about. Iris mentioned agricultural exchange, also an enabling tool, digitizing supply chains, and then connecting that to bank to unlock the data for financial services while keeping the farmers organized and independent. And at the same time, and that's also been mentioned already, it needs a kind of ecosystem approach. You need technical assistance, you need capacity building to do that or to organize those farmers. And a very important point there is often we speak about fair data, and it's a favorite topic of NGOs and others, and even of ourselves in Rabobank. But our opinion is that fair data comes also with responsibility of the beneficiary. And that basically means if you manage to get data ownership at farm level, and you also have the accountability and responsibility there, that is fair, but it's also a business case that improves, because you can shift some of the transaction costs as a service provider to those organizations, which is not so different to what happens in microfinance if you look at group lending and other similar, let's say, organization models. So ownership comes with responsibility, and I think that's a key takeaway also from our experiences, and also to make things scalable.
Thanks, Albert. And these examples are actually great to visualize how data sharing would actually look in real life. And also it emphasizes the fact that it's already happening, but we need to make it or like amenable or make it facilitated between organizations. And that's where I think the coalition can play an important role. Another thing you mentioned is around farmer cooperatives and collectives playing a role. So that comes to the point of data governance, and you're making actually collectives of farmers more responsible for their data. And data governance is going to be key to data sharing. And again, another cross promotion, we are having a session on data governance in the evening today, which is going to speak about farmer-centric data governance. So thank you for that. And before moving on to the section on what we should do for data sharing or to mainstream data sharing, I'll just look at Simon again. Simon, do you have anything to add on the potential benefits of data sharing, or would you like to reinforce any of the points that have come from the other panelists?
Yeah, maybe a bit of a combination of the two. Thanks, Sridhar. I think for us, one of the things that we're increasingly aware of is that there are, let's say, zones of needs and zones of opportunity, and the markets are clearly going to be working better in those zones where farmers are already more professional, already more productive, already more engaged with market partners. And there's an increasing risk of increasing inequality, let's say, and greater challenges to achieve living incomes in the underserved areas. But we don't have enough data on exactly where those are and what the farmers' needs are in those zones. And I think this data ecosystem strengthening could enable both policymakers to then get more targeted when where they're offering incentives and providing support to more risky and underserved farmers, but also to the private sector to say, right, this zone is actually making progress. This is where we can now go and start sourcing from, because we weren't able to previously. We didn't have enough confidence that the farmers were going to be reliable suppliers, or on the input side, customers, or the financial service side, customers, and so on. So I think this zoning piece for us is really a critical need and opportunity, and it gets then into a crossover with what's happening on the climate smart and regenerative agriculture side around the evolving focus on landscapes and foodscapes, and how to strengthen the ways that farmers are supported in vulnerable landscapes and landscapes of need. So I'm seeing a lot of opportunity there. I'm also seeing that, and we've been pioneers in and longstanding players in index insurance solutions for smallholders, which is a great concept, but practically very difficult to offer when it's done standalone. But when you offer it as part of a bundled solution package with credit, with inputs, with output market commitments from off-takers, then it becomes a highly attractive value proposition. And this is just one example, but there are many of these kind of bundled solution offers, I think, that can be developed when we understand better what's actually happening with the farmers on the ground. Thirdly, I think it's come up already, but this point about the cost to serve and reducing the cost to serve based on significantly reduced access to data costs, I think this is a huge enabler. One of the things that we've really struggled with our last mile and first mile models is, the entrepreneurs who are providing a range of services to smallholders within their communities want to provide those services, but they don't want to spend a lot of time collecting data. And even when you pay them specifically to collect data, then is it reliable data? Is there a way of, fact checking or fact proofing that data is reliable, or they're just making up numbers because they're getting paid? These kinds of questions come up all the time, and it's a cost issue because it's time at the end of the day. So the more we can reduce those costs, the better. Also, I think we've heard, this point about, which I made earlier, but most speakers have made, that, there's these multiple efforts to engage with farmers using digital services and database services. Farmers are getting tired. They don't want to be enrolling in yet another system. And the more we can reduce that farmer fatigue and make it much easier for the farmers again, the more we're going to benefit. And then finally, I think on the reporting side, I mean, many of you have mentioned M&E, but there's a lot of rising tide now in terms of consumers and regulators wanting to understand in different ways what's happening with farmers. There's Scope 3 commitments that are, creating potentially very high demand on food companies and food value chains. to be reporting on what's happening in terms of emissions and related activities with farmers. And again, this cost could be prohibitive if we're not able to strengthen the ecosystems, but it's also about standards. You know, consumers and other actors want to know that farmers are engaging productively with agroecology, with regenerative agriculture, with sustainable practices, good agricultural practices, and being able to have a low cost but highly accurate and specific way of capturing whether those standards are being adopted or not adopted and what's resulting from the adoption of those standards. This is a very important enabler for us to both engage the private sector, particularly, that's under pressure to have those reporting standards increasingly in place. But also, and this is something that we're very focused on at our foundation, supporting the low-income and vulnerable smallholders to be able to adapt to climate change, because many of them actually are not going to benefit. I mean, Acorn is fantastic, and I'm a great fan of what Rabobank is doing with Acorn and other innovators who are trying to do the carbon credits for smallholders. But frankly, most smallholders that we're focused on, their carbon footprints are very low right now, and the opportunities to sequester carbon through agroforestry, through above ground carbon, are also quite limited. So being able to support climate adaptation is really a top need and urgent priority. And again, we need to be able to access and use data that enables us to understand what's happening there. So that's just a few additional thoughts, Srijit.
Thank you so much. And it's very clear. So one of the things you also mentioned, and it goes back to the cost of data collection. So maybe over data sharing, when we start analyzing it better, there might be a case for pre-competitive collaboration and data collection. So maybe that's something that will emerge. And also, like I think when it comes to adaptation, and you spoke about landscapes, there's also potential that data sharing might fuel climate adaptation plus mitigation when it comes to landscapes. So thanks for this. So I'll move to the section on what can the coalition do to promote data sharing. And actually, before going one by one and asking for recommendations, I would just go back to Albert and try to understand from him that there have been efforts on promoting data sharing at a sectoral level before, and there has been some movement there. But according to you, Albert, like what is it that the coalition is doing differently, and what would you say would be key drivers in the coalition's mechanism of promoting data sharing? And just so that others can start planning, I'll ask Brenda first on her recommendations for promoting data sharing. If that has to be done at the sectoral level, what would be, let's say, 2 key steps that will need to be taken? And then I'll move to Sheila and then the others.
No, thanks, Srijit. Very quickly, agriculture is lagging behind when it comes to data sharing. You can find great initiatives, for instance, with airline companies who share engine performance data. But if you take that as an inspiration, it's useful because the governance and the technology, it's all there and it can be copied. But of course, there are 300-400 million smallholder farmers who are all different instead of 10 different engine types. So that's already, in terms of standardization, very different. Even Rabobank joins initiatives like joint data, combining milking robots data with off-taker data, etc. But it's not about smallholders, and even the solutions we have, like Data Keeper, where you keep your personal data profile on your smartphone. Most smallholder farmers don't have smartphones, so the applicability of all those initiatives is limited. We've seen many initiatives, and we studied them and had interviews on data sharing in agriculture around smallholder farming as well, but they're often very broad when it comes to use cases. Or they're focusing only on the farmland and not on the let's say the identity of the farmer itself. So what makes this initiative different is that it's very much focused on use cases. It's a bottom-up approach, or it's basically bottom-up and top-down, and then we end up somewhere in the middle. But it's very much use case driven, and I haven't seen initiatives that address that in a structural way. So I'm really happy with all the support and involvement of all the organizations present here. And as Simon also mentioned, this is not a closed shop, so happy to have more organizations involved in that as well.
Thank you, Albert, for highlighting that. So we are doing bottom up, we'll try top down, and we'll end up in the middle, which makes it unique. That's something to keep, because yeah, then I think if we are all proactive, things will move, and hopefully agriculture will mimic something that is happening in the other sectors. Brenda, moving to you. Always love your ideas. So just want to hear from you, what according to you would be first few steps if you have to promote data sharing in agriculture?
Thanks, Srijit. I think we, as others have mentioned, we also need to focus on policy. When you're looking at data-driven policy decisions, when they're informed by evidence, informed by what's happening with the use cases, what's happening on the ground, that will enable targeted interventions, especially in approaches where opportunities exist, and also in terms of where we can have quick wins and where we need even to create more value proposition for both private sector and public sector for win-win outcomes. So policy is going to be very important. Other aspect that I think Albert and Simon are mentioning is how to ensure that we have equitable distribution of benefits, especially for smallholder farmers. Most of this data that we are collecting where we're building solutions is coming from smallholder farmers. We build solutions that are targeting smallholder farmers, but the benefits usually does not translate back to the smallholder farmer. So the coalition, if you look at it, is actually smallholder farmer-driven approaches. We focus on smallholder farmers, and therefore we are looking at how to ensure that as we're looking at data, we're looking at open data, data sharing, we also translate that to equitable distribution of benefits back to the smallholder farmers. The other aspect is that, as everyone mentioned, the coalition is actually extending to other like-minded institutions. Us coming together, creating much more bigger ecosystem, much more bigger, convening of these issues enables us to look at standardization, because Rabo, IFAD, and Syngenta, ICU, and IDH, we are part of that ecosystem, but we're a small part of that ecosystem. We need MNOs to come in. We need private sector to come in. We need people that are driving, that are collecting data, utilizing this data, so that we can actually facilitate much more secure in terms of data sharing protocols, standards, and agreeing what can be done. And even if we start at national level, creating much more, the drive towards more regional and global. This is exactly where we want to achieve. So those are some of the things that will enable us to move away from just piloting few use cases to creating much more of a movement towards an ecosystem-based approach towards data sharing. Over.
Thank you, Brenda, and that's very clear. We have a question from the audience before moving on to Sheila, but this is related to the second point you made, that how do you make farmers very centric to the benefits that are coming from data sharing? So one comment which is on Wova platform is that nowadays data is often pulled out from farmers without anything given back to them or pushed back to them. So they just wanted to understand, have you seen use cases where farmers are actually benefiting from the data they are sharing? And do you have any ideas on how this can be more mainstream?
Exactly. I think most of the times when we are collecting data, the first time we're doing farmer registry, the value proposition for why do I need to register? Why do I need to put my information on farm? But if we're able to build services, what we have seen in IFAD projects is that we're able to utilize a farmer registry to build projects around the farmer register. Sometimes even this farmer registry is owned by government. They're the ones who have actually supported the farmer registry, but out of it, we're able to build new projects for value chain integrations, for example, in a daily value chain, whereby we've just developed a project, and that is actually going to support and pull data from a farmer registry to enable access to finance, access to markets, and even access to other services. We are developing one pilot with FAO and in a bank in Uganda, where we're actually piloting some kind of a use case like this, where farmers have registered on a platform, but out of this farmer registry, other services, they are able to access services, for example, access to finance and also access to inputs. And then that's the return that goes back to the smallholder farmer. If they're able to see that the data that I was able to produce on the farm, right, is able to allow me to access other services, access inputs, access to financial services, that's when you create a value back to the farmer. The issues that Albert was talking about, where Econ is doing carbon credits, this is the value back to the smallholder farmer. It's not actually just supporting Rabobank, but it's also supporting the smallholder farmers gain some other services on top of it. So that's where we want to see value proposition and end-to-end services that is a win-win, create a win-win situation, both for private sector and also in terms of the smallholder farmers and other institutions involved in that ecosystem. Over.
Thank you, Brenda, and that's very clear. So sometimes the value to smallholder farmers is maybe not monetization of data, but the value of getting access to other services of quality, which improves their income through better production, better market linkages, etc. So that's great to hear. And also you mentioned that maybe in a lot of projects today, we identify the project and build a farmer registry, but you can turn it around. There are already farmer registries with governments, etc., and you can build programs around that. So that's another example of how we can use a bottom-up approach. Sheila, going back to you on data sharing. So if you had to promote data sharing at the agriculture sectoral level or between stakeholders that ICIL works with, what would be your first 2 steps or key recommendations to promote it?
Thanks, Srijit. So I'm going to pick up from what Brenda was saying just now about having a movement. We've talked about ecosystem, so many stakeholders, making sure, data is transferred, used well. I think one of the things that we really need is supporting organizations in how data sharing can happen. So data sharing doesn't mean that anyone can do anything with your data. Data sharing can take many forms, depending on the scale and the complexity of what you're doing. And both parties continue to have rights and responsibility for the data that they're managing. So Albert talked about, ownership comes with responsibility. Srijit, you talked about data governance. All this is really important. There's so many entities out there handling data right now. And we need to have clear guidelines that guide companies in sharing data so that we're able to safeguard the credibility and the use of data better. So some are front runners, but I think having these kind of clear guidelines to enable more organizations to share data in a safe way, provide the guidelines, what they need to do within their organizations when they work with partners and when they work in multi-sector platforms or, multi-stakeholder initiatives as well. How do you do that well? So on the one side, clear guidelines to support the broader ecosystem on how they use data better. On the other side, I think it's also having data standardization. We heard interoperability, common language. We need to get better at coming together to reduce that redundancy, reduce that effort that we're placing the burden on smallholders when they provide data. So really data standardization. And this is one area that ICIL's working with our members to develop a core metadata set. And we see this as the beginning of a global language for sustainability information. So similarly, in other spaces as well, is to promote more data standardization.
Thank you, Sheila. So it's about guidelines because data sharing can happen, but it's about doing it in the right way because we are starting now and promoting it. So data governance, security, giving back to farmers, there have to be proper guidelines and data standardization. Thank you for these 2 points. Iris, I'll move to you for your 2 recommendations on promoting data sharing at an ecosystem or a systems level.
Thanks, Srijit. And I think lots of already very useful comments have been given. So let me try to add something new. I think building on the point of Simon, and Simon, you were referring to zoning, which was a new term for me, but we always love new terms. So let me also use an unused one. I think when discussing data sharing, it will be very helpful to also look into farmer segmentation. So data will help us to better understand farmers because they're not a homogeneous groups. They have they're different subgroups with having different needs. So using data to segment farmers and then being able to, by farmer segmentation, adjust those bundled services, including services for climate adaptation. I think this will help a lot for our sector becoming more effective. And this is probably something which is also still underutilized as data sharing is not yet a common practice. So let's build a few more use cases on how data can help to segment farmers, how segmenting farmers can help to adjust, tailor bundled packages that have impact. And then let's use as much as possible real-time data. So I think Albert referred to a couple of other ways or other types of data, also more objective data. I think real time can help us a lot. We're used to those 3 to 4 year cycles where we get some impact data and we can adjust. Other industries can adjust real time because they get their data in on what's working, what's not working, and they course correct directly. I think we can use that to speed up and course correct much more quickly. I think my other point, Srijit, is with this coalition, we need to walk the talk. So I think it's very good that we develop very practical use cases on the how-tos. Let's walk the talk together and make sure that our insights are comparable and that we are using the same data on those use cases on what's working and what's not working, because I think we should design for skill. So not to think about skill later on, but if we're able to crowd in like-minded organizations that also believe that data sharing has very clear benefits for business, for farmers, for the public sector, then let's make sure that we are ready to crowd in those other like-minded organizations and scale and have comparable data, and not amongst ourselves have different use cases with slightly different data points, which won't allow for creating those insights and which will make it more challenging to get to better informed decisions. Back to you, Srijit.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you. And it's very important to walk the talk too. So I am pretty sure that given the enthusiasm of all organizations over the last 3 months in putting this together, I think there will be actual walking the talking, if I may call it that. So for the last questions, I'll just give Simon and Albert one minute each to reflect on, if you had to define success for this coalition, how would you define success? So Simon, we can start with you and then move on to Albert.
Great, thanks. Great discussion, guys. Very exciting to see how we can make progress here. I think just building on a lot of the comments that were just made, really success for me in the very short term is having these productive use cases and the evidence for them, and the evidence of the value for 3 major sets of stakeholders. One, obviously, the farmers themselves. Are they really enabling the farmers to get access to better innovations, better services, better market opportunities, and having resulting productivity and income improvements? Are they benefiting the public sector because the public sector now has a better understanding of how to do smart policy making, repurposing its incentives and subsidies according to the data that's being revealed, and a better understanding of what data needs to be in the public domain at what level? This whole, we haven't talked that much about data privacy on this call, but this whole issue of how do we have bundled data at an aggregated level, whether it's, by segments, as Iris was talking about, or by geographic zones or landscapes, as I was talking about, that's where the data can be public very easily and guide policymaking and guide investors and guide nonprofits and so on. And then the third group is the private sector. We need the private sector to engage in these use cases and share data. It's no good for the private sector to sit back and say, well, we need the data and then we can offer the services, but we're not going to share data back. That's not acceptable. Private sector has to be part of these ecosystems and playing value. So for me, that's probably the most important, very short-term success. I think in the long term, it's really seeing that we have better pre-competitive collaboration then between the public sector and the private sector and nonprofits and innovators, so that over time we're using this data for long-term change, and particularly coming back to the points I was making and others were making before about dealing with climate change, both on the adaptation and mitigation side.
Thank you, Simon. And Albert, over to you for a last 1 minute comment on what success looks like, and then we'll close the session. Thank you.
Yeah, very quickly. Success is if we have the first use cases where data sharing enables product bundling in a way that is profitable for the farmer and also for the service provider. And longer term, I would be happy if we started to understand better the diversity of solutions that is needed, because we know smallholder farmers are very different, call it clustering or zoning or whatever. So there's no one size fits all solution, and that would be the next step. Understanding the context and pushing the frontier year by year.
Thank you, Albert. I like the comment on year by year. So this gives me a good way to close the session. And just like Simon highlighted in the beginning, this is not even a midline or the end line. This is the starting point, and we are open to collaboration. And given that more than 800 people from across 60 countries registered for this event, I think there is a willingness to learn about data sharing, and we would be available after this event. We'll be rolling out a form which will allow you to contribute to this effort, and we'll also seek ideas from you. Secondly, also, while I'm closing it, it also gives me the best opportunity to promote other sessions. There was a question on data collection. It's good to tell you that we have a session dedicated on data collection and how can you optimize it for modern agriculture. That's one session. We spoke about privacy, but we didn't cover it in this call in detail. We have a session exclusively on data privacy and security for smallholder farmers. So we are having a full day packed agenda, and after the event, there's also an intention to release a white paper. Also, just wanted to highlight that in between two sessions, like after every two sessions, we have 30 minutes of a networking break. If you are on Whova, you can use that to initiate your conversations with other stakeholders and start actually thinking about partnerships for data sharing. I would like to close by thanking everyone, and thank you so much for your time to the speakers and also for the audience that has attended this session. And I hope, like I said, this is a beginning of fruitful partnerships towards data sharing. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks to you, Srijit.
Thanks, Srijit.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Cheerio.